Hello, Politics Plus Media 101 listeners. We are here one night after the first Republican primary debate, which was held in Milwaukee. It was an auspicious occasion, our first look at most of the candidates on a stage, of course, with the absence of the frontrunner, Donald Trump. So we have got quite a bit to talk about. We're going to do a bit of punditry and give you our assessment of how the event went and how everyone performed.
Yeah, John, I went into this rather non-enthused. I thought it was going to be a snooze fest. I really wasn't looking forward to it. But I must say, at the end of the day, it was extremely entertaining, which is both a commentary on what American political debates are, especially on the Republican side of the aisle.
I agree that the event was very entertaining and I had no problem watching the whole thing. And that was something that I wasn't sure was going to be the case going in. There's so much negativity around politics, especially on the Republican side of the aisle these days. It's all doom and gloom. And we did get quite a bit of that, but it was fast paced. There was a lot of rhetorical combats, which is always interesting to listen to. I've noticed that in the past, often the pattern is that the first debate in the cycle is a bit dull because it tends to be kind of amicable. And the candidates emphasize what they have in common, that they're all going in under the same party banner. And then when polling continues, we get closer to the primaries, then that's when the competition really kind of emerges and there's sharper barbs and the candidates are going after each other. They usually tone down the attacks in the first debate. And this time, it was relievingly combative from the get-go. And that's kind of what you want to see when you go into one of these. I mean, we always bemoan the rancor in politics, but on a debate stage, you want to see distinctions and differences and arguments between the candidates. So it's frustrating when you don't get that the first debate of the cycle almost every other year. But this year, we got it right away. And so that was kind of nice.
In this debate, I think it was very different because everybody is so far behind former President Trump in the polls that there is a sense of urgency. So couple that sense of urgency with Trump staying out of it, along with what this means for these people in their lives. Many of them, it was their first time on a presidential debate stage. So there's anticipation, there's energy. And I thought we saw some surprising performances.
I think all of them, it was their first time in a presidential debate stage, with the exception of Christie. And then Mike Pence had been in nationally televised debates because he had been in 2 vice presidential debates. But that is quite a different matter. It's one-on-one. It's a much lower profile affair. And you're not competing with people in your own party. So this was still very much a new experience to him as well. It was really only Christie that had experience in this format. And as to what you're saying about the sense of urgency and what it means for the field that there is a frontrunner who seems so far ahead, at least in a lot of the polling, there was a question, I think, going into the debate over whether they did feel a sense of urgency. I think we didn't quite know because there was a few different ways that the candidates could be thinking about being so far behind. One is that we really need to make up ground. We need to be aggressive. And you might think that that would be the natural approach. But there's also, in some cases, a sense of kind of defeatism and a kind of resignation to the idea that Trump is going to be the nominee again. And instead, what you get is an interest in elevating your profile for other reasons, in jockeying perhaps to be a cabinet nominee or a vice presidential nominee. But I think what we did see from some of the candidates was that sense of urgency. And we'll get into that as we kind of go through them. And we saw from some of the candidates that sense of resignation. So it is interesting that they've approached it in different ways. But we did see a kind of ambition and aggression that I think that many of us were hoping to see from candidates who are not Donald Trump.
I think the candidate that probably surprised me the most because of the sense of urgency that they displayed and their willingness to just disregard the rules and go for the throat was Mike Pence. Now, we need to understand that this is all in the larger context of the Republican Party, the GOP primary. So we have to caveat what I'm about to say with that in so far as Mike Pence is going nowhere. However, he came out really prepped. And at one point, I want to say he filibustered for like 2 minutes after the moderators tried to shut him up. I think it was
more than once.
Brett Baer and They
a couple
tried
times. Yeah, he was going way after the bell.
they like
They had a little
interjected.
school bell to try to make him stop. It almost like playing people off at the Oscars. He was just blowing right through, and several of the other candidates were doing the same thing.
Yeah, but for Mike Pence, somebody who has made himself as a Christian conservative that plays inside the rules, that calls his wife mother, that won't, meet with another woman in a closed room without his wife. This guy, he's given off the persona for the last 30 years that he is not the rule breaker. So not only for him to ignore the rules, but also just go at somebody's throat like he did Vivek Ramaswamy, that was both stunning and refreshing.
I think it's a reminder that these people are more than their caricatures, right? So you described the kind of archetype of Mike Pence, the common understanding of the type of person that he is. And it has a lot to do with his very sincere and devout religious faith and his often kind of reserved persona. But it's what we saw last night was a reminder that he was also a radio host, and so he has an experience in that kind of format and a personality that's a little bit more complex. If we're going to do the ranking of the candidates, which is something we talked about doing right before we started recording, I actually have Mike Pence at number 1 on my list.
Before we get into the rankings, you're going to have to give me your criteria of how you rank them.
I think that there is a temptation for pundits to try to project their ideas on the voters and try to imagine how the voters are reacting to things and rank them that way. Like, oh, who do I think impressed my idea of the Republican voter based on the redneck SFRs that I've been reading in the New York Times? But I think that to a large extent is a fool's errand, because the Republican voters will continue to surprise us. They're a very complex category of people. And even some of the polling that we've been seeing in the day after the debate defies the attempt that was made by so many pundits to try to imagine what they were thinking. So I think a better way to rank, and what I'm going to try to do, is based on who impressed me. So this is more my subjective reading of how I think the candidates performed, not whether I think that they persuaded Joe the plumber in Missouri. It's whether I was compelled by their performance.
That sounds pretty close to how I'm going about it. The way that I am determining whether or not a candidate impressed me the most is based on what I personally believe they needed to accomplish with this specific debate. Whether or not they were able to accomplish that and how much they did or did not over or underperform, that's how I rank 7 of them. Because I do think there was such a far and away winner with what I perceive the Republican voter to want and like, for a variety of reasons that we can get into. That person is in their own category, and it's based on what you originally said that pundits tend to do. I am just so confident in this take.
The mind reading.
And I feel that the mind reading, and I feel that polls will, it's like, and I use this analogy a lot, John. The pundits may claim that they, grew up in the Tea Party or the House Freedom Caucus or the Trump movement, but I was born in it. Going back to the Bane Batman analogy. So like I feel like I have a pulse on these folks.
Yeah, listeners are familiar with this claim, which can be disputed, but we're speaking about a graduate of St. Paul's School.
Man of the people.
So we are going to first thing I'm going to do is just list off the 8 candidates in alphabetical order, and then we'll give our rankings. So the candidates are Doug Burgum, and he's the governor of North Dakota, Christie, former governor of New Jersey, Ron DeSantis, governor of Florida, Nikki Haley, former governor of South Carolina, Asa Hutchinson, former governor of Arkansas, Mike Pence, former vice president, Vivek Ramaswamy, who is an entrepreneur and aspiring media personality, and then Tim Scott, who is a U.S. senator from the state of South Carolina. So, Justin, shall I give my rankings first, and then we'll go over to you?
Yeah, is that how you want to do it, or do you want to go number for number?
I was going to just do the list.
Okay, do the list.
We're going to get sidetracked. We're going to go into each candidate. We'll fill all the time before we get a chance. Okay, so I want to emphasize that this is very fluid, and I could switch the positions of most of these candidates. And as much as I'm trying to do it according to the criteria that I explained, of course, it's mixed in with so many other things. So number one on the list, I already said, is Mike Pence. I think that he impressed me the most, especially according to expectations, part of what we were talking about before. Number two, so I kind of went back and forth on this one because I actually have a lot of criticisms of some of the substance of what this person said, but this person still overperformed a lot according to my expectations. So I put as number two, Governor Haley. Number three is Governor Christie. Number four is Mr. Ramaswamy. Number five, and this is where we're getting kind of into the second tier. I feel like there's a clear first tier and second tier. So these, a lot of them are pretty, it's a real movable feast once we're into the undercard here. But number five, I actually have Governor Hutchinson. Number six, I put Governor DeSantis. Number seven, I put Governor Burgum. And in last place, I'm very sorry to say, I have Senator Scott.
We have some similarities in there. The way that I view my list, based on what I thought these people needed to accomplish, is I do have 4 tiers. The first tier is what I believe to be the undisputed winner. I say that in part because I wanted to smack him around. Like I don't mean that literally. We don't believe in political violence, but the emotions I were feeling towards this candidate were just so strong in the repulsive direction. It's Vivek Ramaswamy. I thought
I knew that's who you're going to say with that preamble. Yeah.
Unfortunately, I disagreed with most everything he said. I thought he was able to take the position of the leader of the debate stage, suck all the oxygen just out of the room to position himself as an outsider. And in doing all of that, he suffocated Ron DeSantis, which, if you look at the polling, it's important if you're neck and neck for that. The next tier, like you said, is really interchangeable. Like you, I thought Mike Pence did enough to justify getting more money from donors, and especially establishment types. The next one on the list was Nikki Haley. I thought she did really good. You and I had done a show previewing her candidacy, and we made the points that she is known for being quick on her feet. And I think that she did a relatively really good job of that. And then the end of this tier would be Christie, number 5. I thought they had a terrible debate, but they didn't make a mistake. They didn't get eviscerated like Chris Christie did to Marco Rubio, like Elizabeth Warren did to Michael Bloomberg. However, you can't do that when you are sinking in the polls like a lead balloon, when you were once built up by Fox News as the alternative to Trump. It's Governor DeSantis. I thought he wilted. I thought he kind of sunk into the background. He did have moments, which is why he's number 5, where he tried to pretend like he was a leader, which I want to get into, the climate change and abortion sections a little bit. But it was very clearly forced, scripted. He had planned this out with his super PAC, Axiom Strategies, and Vivek called him out for it, called him a scripted super PAC puppet, which I was on the floor laughing. And DeSantis doesn't. Then the bottom 3, the way that I characterize this last tier of 6, 7, 8 is they need to drop out of the race. So Burgum, who I personally find very interesting, he had the most moderate but yet conservative answer on abortion. He said no, there should be no federal ban. He's eccentric, he's self-made, he's brilliant, even though, again, we disagree with him on some things. I think he's a fascinating person. I went and hung out with him a little bit at a Republican Governors Association conference in DC. He's a fun guy. And you generally want to be around extroverts, because what is an extrovert? It's not somebody that needs the center of attention. It is somebody that gets energy and joy out of being around other people. And typically speaking, that makes a good politician.
I will say, though, that we did not get that from his performance at the debate. That did not come off at all.
He allegedly broke his leg beforehand. We saw what that did to Rick Perry in 2012 when he was all high on painkillers. He couldn't name 3 federal agencies he wanted to cut.
I think that he was quite nervous. He seemed as though he was stumbling over his words a bit under the bright lights. And I think that it's an interesting lesson and a reminder that even for people who have accomplished so much in their life and career, you wouldn't think would be intimidated by national television. It's a completely different experience being on national TV in this kind of setting. And anyone can get nervous. You know what I mean? Even someone who's a billionaire, who's the governor of a U.S. state. And he really did seem nervous. And I think that that's something people should keep in mind. We can look at these performers and assess how they've done, but it's quite a difficult thing to do. It is what they sign up for, though.
Well, it's their dream. And the analogy I make, John, our last episode was on baseball. It's the Major League Baseball player making their debut. This is the first debate. So of course they were all terrified, right when it started. Like, you have to be nervous. The last two, Hutchinson, he needs to drop out. I think his performance was really bad. I didn't know if he was sick or what was going on. It was just nondescript. He needed to make a splash. He needed to have that viral moment to justify staying in the race. And then Tim Scott, I mean, he was awful. He is a candidate that I would say has pulled specific issues with the Republican electorate, and he's running on those specific issues without anything interesting, incisive, or impactful to say. He is somebody that not only would you forget if you were listening to the debate and watching it, that he was even on stage, but his delivery was so slow and mild-mannered, and he was stumbling, and not only stumbling, he just couldn't get his words out. I think that paper tiger has been lit on fire. It's time to put that to bed. Thank you very much for coming. Please don't come again.
So I think that Senator Scott is a talented politician, and he's a talented speaker and presenter, but he has a very specific style. It's very slow, very, like you said, kind of conciliatory, mild-mannered, I think was the term that you used. And in some settings, it works really well. It works well in town hall settings. It's worked well often in the U.S. Senate. It can work in certain live campaign settings, but it is uniquely poorly suited for this format. And unfortunately, this is the biggest spotlight that you get during this process. And I also have him last, not because I think he has no talent, but because I think he really underperformed our expectations. Maybe we should have prepared ourselves for the understanding that his style was not going to work in this format. But I think especially when we're thinking about the trajectory of this primary, his poor performance is particularly damaging because there was a hope that he could end up becoming the next candidate who attracts attention from supporters once Ron DeSantis's balloon is popped. There was a lot of hope that he could be that guy. But because of how well Pence, Haley, Christie did, and how Scott kind of faded into the background, it seems as though that's a lost opportunity. And the interest of the sorts of people who might have been ready to turn to Scott, it's not going to be in that direction. So I think that for what was needed to be accomplished last night for the trajectory of the race, he performed the poorest.
2 points I want to add on. Not only is his style uniquely poorly suited for that format, I would say the same thing for the GOP primary electorate. I'm not saying you have to run a negative campaign and you can't run on hope and policies. I'm saying that especially the Republican primary electorate, but American voters in general, they need somebody with teeth or backbone or bite. We loved President Obama for his hope and change campaign. But if I bring you back to those debates against Hillary Clinton, dude, they were vicious. They were going at each other's throats. And Obama's not even a great debater. So that is just to say, to be successful in this format, you need to make a splash in some way, especially when you're trying to come from behind to justify funding, to get that momentum in the polls. And he just didn't do it. And the way you do make a splash is by attacking someone.
Well, what I would say to that is that there has been a pattern of voters turning to someone who's very different from the last incumbent, right? And we've seen that. At the time, George W. Bush seemed very different from Clinton. Clinton seemed very different from George Bush, too. And then Barack Obama was a huge contrast with George W. Bush, and Trump, massive contrast with Obama. Biden, massive contrast with Trump. And, Trump is also very different from the last nominees on the GOP side, too. I mean, because something worked last time doesn't necessarily mean that a different approach isn't going to work. Sometimes it's good to draw a big contrast. And there is the possibility that Scott's kind of fresh and different approach could be appealing to people, but you have to get oxygen in the room. You have to get attention. And that was what I think he really felt. I mean, there were certain times during the debate last night where Pence started taking that kind of slow sermon tone, but he had the presence of the stage and he was, making a meal out of those words, even as he was delivering them in that style. So I guess it is proof that you could take a style like that and get that oxygen, and Scott wasn't doing that.
No, Pence got the oxygen largely because he was willing to come out firing. And I would say all the politicians that you mentioned that were winners, they had backbone. It wasn't meek, milk toast, and a happy warrior with no gloves. Never mind, take the gloves off. He didn't have any gloves. So I think that as a maxim, this isn't just talking about Trump. We're talking Obama and everybody else, even Biden and further back. The American voter loves a puncher. Sure, that person can be more mild-mannered. They can be happy, and that would buck the trend of kind of what we're seeing now in the GOP primary. But that person also needs to be incisive and be able to just land a devastating verbal attack, because I think not only does it show mental acumen, but it also shows the willingness to stand up for yourself, which portrays a sense of confidence.
Yeah, I mean, you definitely need to have confidence. You don't necessarily need to have anger. And I think sometimes if the last cycle we had the anger, sometimes people are ready for a fresh mood. And we've seen that pattern. But he didn't do enough to make his moment on the stage. So we agree about that. So should we turn to any of the candidates that we've gone over and kind of assess their performance? Because we've given these lists. There's a lot of crossover in your rankings and my rankings. I think maybe there's a few differences. Where should we kind of start?
Let's start with Vivek.
Okay, let's start with Vivek.
I'm going to say all the good things. You can then undermine it with all the bad. So caveating all of this with the clear fact that he's somebody who has no problem lying to your face when you have the facts right in front of him. And also that he is a grifter. I think that we can all agree on those facts. I thought what he did was he spoke fast. And generally speaking, that is something that is attractive. It portrays that you are engaged, that you are intelligent, that you might be quick-witted. He was also funny. He had a line about Ron DeSantis saying that he was a scripted super PAC puppet. A couple times, Mike Pence tried to, John, as you were alluding to, get up on his high horse and teach the younger Vivek something about, values or virtue. And Vivek would respond, Mike, I don't get what you're saying. Can you repeat that and make a point? And it was like a funny rebuttal, like saying, old guy, the time has passed you, like chill out. Also, I thought he was shameless. And on the debate stage in the GOP, when you have those other characteristics, that is what gives you the oxygen. It was truly pissing off, like at a deep personal level, all of these egos on the stage. And as a result, he became the person to draw all the fire. All the attention came on him. All the quick and witted attacks went, instead of going for DeSantis, they went to him, which in turn elevated him and allowed him to deepen the contrast between this newcomer and the political establishment.
I mean, so I agree very much that he made himself the main character of the debate, at least for large swaths of the debate. There was one section in the middle where he went quiet and we didn't see him for quite a while, 20 minutes or something. But for a large part of the debate, he made himself the center of attention, the main character. And I agree that that's something that's quite beneficial if you're trying to raise your profile, especially if you're someone who's not particularly well known. So that's a big win for him. That's the reason I put him in the top tier of performers, really. And I think that a lot of the viewers going into last night were expecting that role was going to be filled by Governor DeSantis. There was a Reuters headline that I retweeted after the debate that said something like, the expectation tonight is that Ron DeSantis will be the center of attacks. And reading that headline after watching the debate is kind of funny because that's not at all what happened. I don't think that Ron DeSantis was at the center of any attacks or any attention from any of the other candidates really at all.
This is one of the first questions. Fox News set it up. They went right to Nikki Haley, and they basically set it up so that for her to attack Vivek. And they had set it up on the pregame. There had been leaks that she was going to do this. And initially, she pivoted and attacked DeSantis. The question was, what do you consider, what do you think was behind Vivek's rise in the polls? And they were opening up the line of attack. She goes, oh, I don't worry about polls. I'm here to govern. And then she beat on DeSantis. But once he receded, then everybody just said, this guy isn't worth it.
The audience was clearly responding to a lot of what Vivek Ramaswamy was saying, but they were also booing him at times. And I think that it's not necessarily a problem for the primary trajectory to be booed in the room during a primary debate event. And it wasn't just Ramaswamy, it was also Christie at times that was getting booed by the audience. And I don't think that that's necessarily a bad indication. We remember during the 2016 cycle that Trump was getting booed quite a lot by the audiences in the room. And the audience in the room matters. And sometimes when you're at home, you're being informed by the energy in the room. I mean, that's basically how sitcoms with a live studio audience work. You're basically being prompted to laugh. You're being prompted to respond in the same way the audience in the room are. But sometimes, the audience might be conscious of how the people in the room are different from them and they think differently. And so the booing and the applause and the laughs, it tells you something, but it doesn't tell you the whole picture. But he was getting big responses, applause, boos. One thing I'm not sure that he necessarily was getting that much of, which you mentioned, was laughter. I don't really know if he is as funny as you were suggesting. That was obviously one of Trump's biggest assets in these debates, was that he was quite funny. I'm not sure that Ramaswamy really is. The lines that you mentioned that you thought were the good ones, I mean, you're a puppet of the super PACs. I mean, that's not very funny. Like that's the same thing we always hear about political candidates. There's nothing really very original about that. And that comparison to Trump has obviously been informing a lot of the dialogue about his performance last night. But I also saw comparisons to other figures that I thought was interesting. So there were two articles in The Atlantic. There were several that were responding to the event, but there were two by two different writers that compared him not to Trump, but to Ted Cruz, by David A. Graham and McKay Coppins. They both said that Ramaswamy gave them a reminder of not of Trump, but of Cruz. Other people have compared him to Buttigieg, this young guy who's just giving the base exactly kind of what they want. And those are different things. What the Democratic base and what the Republican base want are very different things. But, a young newcomer that is just feeding directly into the audience demand, maybe an interesting comparison. A comparison that comes to mind to me, and I think this is maybe a little bit similar to why Coppins and Graham were comparing him to Cruz, was Ben Shapiro. I thought that he was quite a bit like Ben Shapiro. That fast-talking and kind of childish personality did remind me of that. And I think that is part of why I didn't put him at the very top of the pile, even though he did soak up all the auction, like we were saying, is that his persona is not this big celebrity, a magnet for charisma like Trump and others have been. It's of a annoying, irritating high school debate guy. It's Model UN. He's not someone that you would necessarily want to be around. And that's often been a criteria on which these candidates are judged. There's the famous, would you want to get a beer with this candidate? And I think that he absolutely fails that test, right? If you were at a party and you encountered a person with a personality like that, you would kind of want to end the conversation and go and talk to somebody else. And I think that that's part of why I didn't put him at the very top, because I think that even among voters that responded to Trump's act, there's a lot to dislike about his personality and the way he behaves.
Yeah, I think the Ted Cruz analogy is apt, and that's why I think he was the winner, quite frankly. Ted Cruz would have run away with the 2016 primary had there been no Trump. And last night there was no Trump on the debate stage, and that kind of fits. He's also very annoying and smarmy and fake. And another bad thing about Vivek is, I don't know if, John, to me, he's putting on an affect with his voice. And maybe that's what Chris Christie said when he said, you sound like ChatGPT in addition to all the talking points.
one thing I was looking for ahead of the debate was whether the flirtation with 9/11 conspiracy theories was going to come up, because this was a big news story heading into the debate. The last few days, there had been this news cycle about how Ramaswamy had been suggesting that he was one of these 9/11 truthers who thought that the FBI could have been involved in the 9/11 attacks, that it was an inside job. And I was wondering if this was going to come up. And no one mentioned it. And there's something about that kind of concerns me, which is that I wonder if people on the stage like Christie, Haley, Pence are afraid to find out what today's GOP voters really think about this issue. They don't want to bring it up because they're worried that if they do, they're going to find out that a lot of people in their camp believe this stuff now. And people who came of political age in the 2000s, for whom the war on terror was a real kind of sincere cause, and the rallying around the flag of 9/11 is something that they're proud of, to discover that the GOP had changed that much and we're now fully on board with some of these conspiracy theories is a scary thought. And it might be why some of those candidates did not want to scratch that itch. The other thing that I wanted to kind of just mention about Ramaswamy was I saw a lot of commentary after the debate of people saying, on social media and stuff, white racists in the South would never vote for a Hindu. And I have to say that I think that this is such an unsophisticated notion of how prejudice actually works. And people will be continually surprised at how good even prejudiced people are at compartmentalizing. And you see this all the time. If you speak to people who have prejudices, they'll often make excuses for, oh yeah, except my neighbor, or oh, except my friend. And if they find that someone who is from a minority group seems to share some of their prejudices, that's one of the most exciting things in the world. So I think that absolutely is not an inhibiting factor. I think that you'll find so many times that people who do have prejudice are willing to make these kinds of excuses and exceptions and rationales. Think about Donald Trump and how, right before he became a big candidate, New Yorkers, Wall Street, Hollywood, these were all the things that they claimed that they hated. And they've always found a way to put in a little box and pretend that it's not there. I think that people would be surprised at the willingness of prejudiced people to support somebody who has a different demographic profile than they do.
Well, of course, John, it's a permission structure of sorts, right?
Yeah.
I think next we should go to Chris Christie. I want to start where you left off a little bit on an ominous note about, you said Christie maybe didn't want to know what the GOP voters thought about 9/11 conspiracy theories, right? And I think that's a adroit point that kind of sends chills down my spine. But there was another couple instances that sent chills down my spine, and specifically when Hutchinson, but also Christie, were attacking Ramaswamy for making the claim that he would pardon Trump and trying to get everybody else on stage, including Mike Pence, the man that Trump tried to have murdered, commit to pardoning this soon-to-be felon. And Christie made very logical points. They were based in fact. It was very simple. It was done in a way that was spoken through conservative values, where you need to defend and uphold the Constitution. Trump tried to suspend, not defend the Constitution. The reaction of the crowd on Christie's attacks on Ramaswamy and Trump was to just drown him out with vociferous boos, to the point where you could not hear Chris Christie, a very loud guy, yelling at the top of his lungs into the microphone. And Bret Baier had to turn around and scold the crowd like school children, telling them they can continue to act like this, and that's all that this show will be. You won't be able to hear responses from the candidates and learn where they stand. And this night will essentially be you just booing, or you can act like adults. They finally calmed down. But at that moment, we've said all of this stuff before, but it kind of like sunk in, and I got very sad at the current state of the GOP, and specifically the primary voter, which dictates the candidates and the talking points and the platforms. It is, at least now, until they suffer some magnificent losses. It is irrevocably broken, and they are a party that values the cultish aspect of a leader, the demagoguery, the almost autocratic and despotic tendencies, the anger and everything else of a candidate, as opposed to the Constitution. They have no desire to focus, follow, uphold, and defend it. And that was made clear with Christie's segment attacking Ramaswamy.
Yeah, that moment that you're describing where Brett Baer had to turn around and shush the crowd. So Chris Hayes on MSNBC, he, I think, quite adeptly pointed that out as the key moment in the debate, because it demonstrated the entire dynamic kind of in microcosm, and not just about the party and the candidates on the stage, but also about Fox News and the role that they were playing in all of this, which was, I think what Baer said to the audience was something like, please just be quiet so we can get through this section and then we'll get back to the other issues. And it showed just that wish that they could move on from Trump and get on to the other issues, get back to the other candidates. But this sense of obligation that they have to address it, it's the elephant in the room. Please, let's just get through this as painlessly as possible and move on. And that's sort of the whole thing, isn't it? And Hayes pointed that out, and I thought it was very clever. You talked about the pardon thing when Ramaswamy was trying to get them all to say that they were pardoned. I thought that was one of Pence's best moments in the debate, if not his best. And I thought he handled that perfectly. It was this kind of sarcastic, condescending thing where he explained how pardons actually work and why it was a ridiculous suggestion by Ramaswamy, saying, look, there has to be two components for a pardon, a conviction and a sense of regret. And we haven't seen either of those factors yet. So if we get to there, then I'll consider it like I will any other pardon. And it was this kind of condescending, you're an amateur, I actually know how this stuff works, that landed really well.
He said guilt and contrition. And the way he said
I was looking for that word.
Conviction and contrition, the way he said contrition was not necessarily in the MAGA language. It was, though, in the evangelical language, where you're asking for forgiveness through the teachings of Christ and you'll be absolved, right? So there was that kind of subtext to it. And he was hitting those voters with the language that they like, and also he was hitting the never Trumpers that are still left in the party. He was giving them the feels like, oh, they hate Trump. They know that this guy is not only a swampy creature, but contrition is anathema to him. It would break his brain if he had to ever think of being genuinely contrite.
And I mean, in the way that Trump actually gave out pardons, contrition was not a major factor. I mean, think about how he pardoned Paul Manafort and Roger Stone and a few others. But just on the Trump thing, because that was a whole segment of the debate, you mentioned Christie. A point that he made that was very important was we're in this box, and the media have really adopted this framework now. They talk about it a lot of the time of waiting to see if he's convicted. And that's the way they were talking about it on stage. Will you pardon him if he's convicted? Will you vote for him if he's convicted? And what Christie said is, let's leave that aside. You know, I'm a prosecutor and, convictions are important and I understand they work. But we also just have to talk about whether this behavior, this conduct was appropriate for a president, legal or illegal. And, that's something that does need to be emphasized a lot of the time. And it's not even just to that audience. It's to talking heads on MSNBC who focus so much on, was this line in the letter of the law crossed? You do have to look at the bigger moral, ethical picture. Hutchinson also said a couple important things during this segment. This is why I put him sixth, like the top of the bottom tier on my list, because I thought he did have a good moment where he got into this question of, would you vote for Trump if he was convicted or endorse him if he was convicted? And what he said, even if it didn't play to a lot of the GOP base, it impressed me. He made a clear position on this issue in a way that DeSantis, Burgum, and Scott did not. So I think overall Hutchinson had a pretty bad night. I think there's a problem with his makeup. I don't think that he has, moved the needle at all in the trajectory of the primary, but he at least had a little bit of time on stage and some of the stuff that he said that impressed me personally. So that's kind of why I put him top to bottom. I guess the other candidate that talked about the Trump thing in an interesting way was DeSantis, because he was adopting the attitude that Brett Baer kind of had of, please, let's just move on from this. And instead of making a kind of sincere comment on where he stood. Just said, look, I've got no beef. Such a bizarre way of talking about something so important.
He was asked about whether or not he could support what Mike Pence did on January 6th, was uphold the Constitution. And this is a microcosm of DeSantis. He doesn't say he supports him. Everybody else on stage basically said they support him. I don't know what Vivek, the fake, said, but DeSantis goes, I've got no beef. It's like, what? Are you a child?
Yeah. It was very, very odd. And it shows how DeSantis has been running from this question. A lot of them have been, but to their credit, all of the other candidates, with the exception of Ramaswamy, said that they believe that Mike Pence did the right thing. And that includes the ones that we said didn't communicate this forcefully, Scott and Burgum, but they still raised their hands. They still kind of made that acknowledgement. And DeSantis had a reluctance to do that in a way that was remarkable. And it shows how he thinks, and the theory of his campaign has been to attack Trump in these creative, unusual ways, trying to attack him from the right on this and that. And none of it really seems to be landing. He clearly has a lot of anger and frustration towards Trump. It's not like he's, in the race the way Vivek Ramaswamy is, where he kind of, would be kind of happy if Trump won. Like, he hates Trump, for the lack of a better word, but he wants to talk about it in a different way. And he's very frustrated that he's not got this clear platform to make these arguments that Trump's bad because of the transgenders or whatever.
You can't be abstract with these attacks like you're mentioning, John. You can't be mealy-mouthed. That's mealy-mouthed. That's what the House Freedom Caucus members run against, is the mealy-mouthed, spineless rhinos that run Washington, D.C., the establishment politicians. This guy was a House Freedom Caucus member. So half measures availed us nothing. And he needs to learn that message. And I think a symbol, maybe the purest symbol of Ron DeSantis's performance, his campaign, everything, was in the Ukraine section. They asked who does not on stage support continued funding for Ukraine. And the only two buffoons to raise their arms were Vivek and DeSantis. And Vivek was very clear, no, we should give Ukraine to Russia. The U.S. has no business doing this. We should not be sending money and troops that we could send to the border to Ukraine. Okay, crazy stuff. But, I understand where he stands. They go to DeSantis and they ask him, so you would not support increasing funding for Ukraine? And he goes, no, I didn't say that. I said Europe should be taking more of the burden. And it's like, you did just say that, and now you're trying to back out of it. So you're giving us no clear proof of where you stand on these issues.
DeSantis on Ukraine, this has been a problem throughout the cycle so far, is that he hasn't figured out exactly how to talk about it and what his position is. And he keeps on trying to get the temperature of the base in the GOP. And he can't even exactly figure out where the temperature in the base of the GOP actually is, because the polling gives different messages and the right-wing media gives different messages. And so he hasn't figured out where he stands, and he's not leading on values or perspective. He's leading, he's following, and he can't figure out even where to follow. And, what it reminds me of a little bit is actually John Kerry in the 2004 election, where his position on the biggest issue of the day, the Iraq war, was not clear enough. And it seemed as though he was one place then the other, and he was kind of trying to follow where he thought the energy in the Democratic Party was and shifting his position a bit. If the biggest issue in the world is in front of you as a presidential candidate, you need to be clear about where you stand. And, you said that Ramaswamy had made a clear position. It wasn't just wrong on the values questions. It was wrong on the strategic concept, but it didn't make sense as an idea. So what Ramaswamy keeps on saying, and he thinks this is very clever, and I know some people on Restrainer Twitter who love what he's saying about this, we should let the Russians take Ukraine, and then we'll make them our allies against China. And if you are a very simplistic person and you're just looking at, Kissinger and Nixon in the 70s opening up China and all of that, I get the concept that you're thinking of, but it doesn't actually work. there isn't an explanation of why Russia will suddenly turn on China and what that will look like and how that happens. But there's also not a lot of consideration about the other actors here. Why would letting Russia annex an independent country deter China from going ahead and trying to annex Taiwan, which isn't even recognized by the United States? And then the other question is, how are the European partners going to respond to this? If you let Russia take this aggression in their back door, a cause that they've fully signed on with, and the U.S. flips its position partway through the conflict and cedes the European territory over to the Russians, I mean, what will this mean for our much more important, much more valuable partnerships with bigger economies, stronger militaries that are so crucial to the U.S. strategy across the world? It does not make sense.
One more thing to add on to your 2 points here. The third point that I would say is take China out of it. Take Russia out of it. Take Europe out of it. What does it say to the smaller countries that we support and that we are against if after 2, 3, what would it be, 4 years almost, or 3 years when the next president comes in, if they come in and do a 180 and say, no, everything that we professed to be a main value of the United States, we don't care. It's took too long. It's a little bit too hard. It's costing too much. Here you go, Russia. Like you said, doing the 180, it would undermine U.S. credibility. Personally, John, I think maybe more than anything Trump did in office. Why would you ever believe a comment from this government again, especially a comment on something that required long-term investment or long-term faith?
So Ramaswamy and fellow travelers think that this is a piece of cold-hearted realpolitik. But even if we take values out of the picture, the idea completely fails as a piece of cold-hearted realpolitik. The thing is, if you really are looking at USA, Russia, China as this kind of triangle, and you want to pick one to peel off from the other, you have to be crazy not to pick China, who are not invading other countries right now, who have an economic relationship with the United States, but who are much more demographically and economically powerful than Russia. I mean, why would you want to partner with the country, Russia, who are posing this direct threat to the other massive major economy in the world, the European Union? I mean, you turn away the European Union and China, the two biggest economies, so you can partner with Putin? It's not good as an idea of just cold-hearted realpolitik. Kissinger would not be impressed.
So they're talking about Ukraine, and Christie then takes the turn. And dude, he is a backroom brawler. He has the Christie knife when he wants to. It's not the energy, right, or the oxygen in the room that he can control. He can shift how the air tastes. It's just so strong, his ability to command and then be a storyteller where he's changing the mood. And he did that on Ukraine. So these two jokers, and then Christie gets up there. And the whole night had basically been your typical American entertaining, mud-throwing political event. And then Christie starts explaining what Russia is actually doing to Ukraine, committing these horrific war crimes by stealing 20,000 children, by shooting people in the back of the head who are defenseless, by making slaves of women and children, by rape as a mechanism of war. And the whole room, which had been so against him, it shook everybody. You could feel it in the audience, and everybody just stopped, and it felt like everything got really still and tense. And not only did it change that momentum, it got the audience like, oh shit, this isn't just a talking point. This is real life, and there are very serious things going on. And then Mike Pence started to attack, and then Nikki Haley started to attack. Ramaswamy tried to jump in and respond because he was just getting crushed by Christie and everybody else. And the crowd booed him, which for up until that point, they had been really on his side. And I was very concerned about how the crowd was going to react to Ukraine. But they booed him to shut him up and to let the others jump in and start attacking him.
I think the moment when Ramaswamy was getting booed was in response to some of the points that Governor Haley was making. And so I think this is kind of a good opportunity to go into the Haley factor. And I think she was very sharp in that moment. I was paying attention to what she was going to say about global affairs because this is how she's tried to develop her persona as a candidate. And my expectations were very low. And I'm not generally very impressed by Governor Haley. And this is part of why I put her number 2 over Christie, because Christie is, I think, almost everyone going into the debate, he had the highest expectations for his performance on the stage. And he was good. But I, especially in that moment, was quite impressed by the way that she spoke about the European issues. However, that is a very different story when we get to the other issues. So she really talked about 3 global issues during the debate: Europe, China, and the Middle East. And so on Europe, she was excellent. On China, she was completely incoherent. And then on Middle East, I think that she actually made a major faux pas. And so I kind of want to go through all of those. But let's start with Europe, because that's kind of where we started. So I think that she made 3 points about Europe and the Ukraine war that are very, very crucial, that she made very clearly, and that the audience needs to hear. And so the first one is that U.S. troops are not engaged in the war and are not in harm's way. And people like Ramaswamy and Tucker Carlson talk about this war as if the United States is fighting in the war. And we are not. We are not. And that has to be emphasized. And every time they talk about it that way, someone needs to come right out and say, we are not fighting in this war, because it's building up this complete misperception about what's happening.
I also think that DeSantis does this, maybe not as explicitly with U.S. troops, but the way that he does it is implicitly saying we can't deal with Ukraine. We need to focus on the southern border. And then his southern border messaging is we need to go to war with the cartels and kill people at the border. And we're spending money on Ukraine and not the southern border. So I think there's also that undertone to what he's doing.
I mean, it's a completely ridiculous, false dichotomy that the support that we're giving to the Ukrainians would apply in the southern border, anti-air, anti-tank.
And also something that Nikki Haley deftly swatted away by saying we can walk and chew gum at the same time.
And the second point, this brings us very nicely to the second point that she made on the Europe issue, which is very important. It's actually a very small percentage of U.S. defense spending that's committed to supporting the Ukrainians in the war that they're engaged in. And that has to be emphasized too, because when you look at the raw numbers, and I was speaking about this with someone here in the Boston area quite recently, they said the number that we're spending, it's massive, it's billions of dollars. But the thing is, when you look at any number that has to do with U.S. federal spending, it's incredibly misleading because the numbers are so large. It's on a scale that people aren't used to and that you can't see in any other context. So you have to look at it as a percentage of our total spending. And it's actually quite small. I think the point was 3%, right? So it's a small percentage of our spending. That needs to be emphasized because when you look at the raw numbers, you might miss that. And then the third point that you made that was quite important is that the Europeans are doing more than people give them credit for. So DeSantis said Europe has to do more. I don't think people object to that necessarily. There's major countries in Europe that people are disappointed a little bit with the scale of their action. Germany comes to mind, but we have to keep in mind that the Europeans are very engaged. They care a lot about this issue. It's an existential issue for the continent. And I think Haley said there are 11 countries in Europe that are putting a higher percentage of their spending into the support for Ukraine. So that's important. And that's something that a lot of Americans in the pundit class and in the electorate are probably very confused about.
Haley's arguments, Pence's arguments, and Christie's arguments on Ukraine specifically were the most important parts because it showed real fortitude and leadership. The easy thing for them to be doing if they were being just politically expedient would be to follow Trump and DeSantis and Ramaswamy. But instead, and this is your point on leadership, they were coming out here. They were saying, these are my values. This is what America should value. This is what you should value. Here is why. And they understood that they were bucking the trend. And they were trying to basically create a new trend within their own party, in the talking class, so on and so forth. And I do think, and this could be wishful thinking, that the crowd responded along with hearing what they needed to hear.
Yeah, I mean, I would also say that the Trump section debate was not as bad as I had feared it was going to be. Like I said, all of the candidates except for Ramaswamy and DeSantis were pretty clear that Pence had done the right thing on January 6th. There was a moment when they asked, would you support him if you were convicted? And people were kind of half-heartedly raising their hands. But I think that actually could possibly be explained by the fact that they had been forced to take this ridiculous RNC pledge that seemed like it might have relevance to that question. They said, will you support the GOP nominee no matter what? And they had to sign that to get on the stage. And I think they were kind of wondering, do I have to do this because of the pledge? And Hutchinson came in and said, look, forget about the pledge. Like, it's consistent with the pledge for me to say I'm not going to support a criminal. Okay. But I think that image of them raising their hands a little bit at that moment, it didn't really reflect the substance of the entire rest of the discussion on that topic. And that was something that I'm glad that we could quickly address. But let's get back to the global affairs stuff. So,
China.
Yeah, China. Let's talk about China next. So I think that there is a major problem for the Republicans in this election because their ambition is to portray Biden as being weak on China. That's something that they want to do. That's how they want to position the race. But they don't really have any substantive complaints with the way Biden is approaching China. And Biden has actually been a lot tougher on China than Trump was. So they can't really point to anything when they try to create this perception. And Haley got in trouble with this because she was trying to find an area where she thought Biden was weak on China, and she ended up talking herself into a pretzel. So it started because climate change had come up.
Do you think climate change was man-made or something like that? Brett Baer then asked everybody to raise their hand. And then DeSantis, who did not want to answer that question because he's been running this online weird campaign, virtue signaling to the most extreme wings of the party. And ironically, dude, he's not as extreme on this issue as Vivek Ramaswamy. So he used it as a pivot to get out of it. And he was clearly coached on, if you get asked to raise your hand on something that everybody else will and you don't want to, try and use this moment to be a leader. Very clearly scripted, I hope you agree.
They wanted it to be a bash the media moment. They saw it as an opportunity. And it was kind of like Newt Gingrich in the 2012 cycle. Do you remember when the opening question in the debate from John King at CNN was, there was a story about you having asking your wife for an open marriage on her deathbed, and Gingrich turned the moment into how could the media ask me this question? And that was what DeSantis was trying to do. Raise hands? That's unfair. Why does the media ask us to raise hands? That's what he was trying to create.
The one point I want to make about Nikki Haley is she was the only one on stage, I believe, to actually acknowledge that climate change was real. And I know that these are small platitudes that we're trying to take here, but I was a little bit heartened by that and said, wow, Ukraine and now climate change, like, hey, this is okay.
Yeah, so I think part of the reason why Governor Haley was eager to say that climate change was a problem was because she saw it as a way that she could try to fit in an attack on Biden having to do with China. Because, like I said, the Republicans especially Haley, want to portray Biden as weak on China, but they can't find very much substantive material to use to make these attacks. But the argument that she ended up making was, I thought, completely incoherent, and it demonstrates this problem, I think, very clearly. So what she said was, China are the biggest contributor to climate change and the biggest issue as we approach climate change because of their massive carbon emissions. True. There's a consensus about that, really. But she said that the U.S. government encouraging people to buy electric vehicles was a big problem because the electric batteries are made in China. And it doesn't add up. It doesn't make any sense. It's a completely incoherent argument because once you acknowledge that we are hoping that the Chinese will reduce their carbon emissions, that they're the biggest factor in carbon emissions, why are you then attacking efforts that help develop green industries in China? Right? I mean, what you're saying is China need to pivot to green industries. Policies that lead to China doing that are thus dangerous. I mean, it doesn't add up. It doesn't make sense.
She's smart. We know that. And I think that what you are describing, she understands, is nonsensical. And from her perspective, China is a foreign policy issue where she can make hay by sounding tough. And this is the way that she wanted to do it, and also drag Biden down. And it just goes to show you that while she's willing to be politically expedient here at the detriment of sounding logical on policy, it also highlights the fortitude that she showed on the Ukraine discussion, because she wasn't willing to do that, because she understands that it is a very serious thing with real world consequences. All of these politicians, and it's important we understand this, they need to make trade-offs.
So I actually disagree quite a lot then. I think that we see this quite differently, because I really do not think that Governor Haley is a very smart foreign policy thinker. I really don't. What I've noticed with her is a tendency to take a very simplistic approach to relations around the world, where it's almost George W. Bush-ish, where she is very eager to categorize countries into good and bad actors and view relations with those countries incredibly simply, and to say any engagement with someone in the bad column is bad, and the countries I put in the good column, get everything from. And I think that she was able to speak about Ukraine well, because it's a very rare issue where the moral situation is genuinely that straightforward. Ukraine good, Russia bad. I mean, it's a rare that there is a moral balance on a topic that is as clear as that. So she is in a good position to speak about that issue well, because she does have this Manichean view of the world. But when you talk about other issues, it doesn't really work. And so that's part of why she can't talk about China intelligently, and how she's trying to point to any engagement that the U.S. do with them as negative, even if it contradicts the other point that she's made about China 5 seconds before. So I've noticed this problem. I've seen her ads on TV, and I think that a lot of the time her idea of how to talk about foreign policy is just to say the names of countries. I've seen her ads where she's saying China bad, China bad, China bad. And where's the beef, as the famous political ad went? It's not a sophisticated worldview. It's a simplistic worldview. But simplistic worldview, it can work when you're talking about something like Russia and Ukraine. And she had some good data, to back up that way of thinking about it too, and made important points. But again, it doesn't work on these other issues.
Well, John, I think it's important to try and play out her argument a little bit more, because there's only 30 seconds or 2 minutes per topic in the debate stage that they get, where logically speaking, she's saying the US should not be dependent on China for their green technology. China should basically create it and use it. Then if you go the next step further, she's probably making a protectionist argument for US manufacturing to bring all of these jobs away from China, decouple in the green tech sector, and bring them all home and set up domestic manufacturing.
Does she then believe that the policy of massive subsidies to US green industries is a positive?
It makes total sense that she's trying to bring back American manufacturing and wean off China, because those are good talking points. Yet those views are incongruent with her view and past statements on American spending, because the spending stuff is all BS. This comment on subsidies on China is probably all BS, but it doesn't need to be coherent. It never is.
I mean, you're not making a defense of her at all.
No, I'm saying that this is what everybody does. It's political expediency, and it is to be expected. However, she could have taken the same track on Ukraine, something that I think matters much more, because there is current ongoing debates about funding levels that will have to go through Congress.
I mean, look, all you've done is acknowledge the incoherency in what she said. It's not a defense of her at all. It's really a criticism. I mean, it starts off the debate trying to make a strong attack against domestic investment. Then she says that there's a big problem that China are doing carbon emissions. Then she says that it's a big problem that they're making green batteries. So either your argument is that the U.S. should be making those green batteries, which is then inconsistent with your attacks on the domestic investment, or you're saying that you just don't want China to be making them generally, and then that's inconsistent with your attack on their carbon emissions. So again, it doesn't add up, and this is a big problem for her in that she's desperate to try to make herself perceived as tougher on China than Biden, but she can't find a way to do it that makes sense, that has any basis. There isn't a clear line of attack there. It's all muddled. So that was a bad moment. The other moment of hers that I thought was really what would amount to like quite a major diplomatic faux pas, and something that if she said as president would create a lot of problems, is that when they started discussing Israel and the Middle East, a point that she wants to use as a point of attack against Ramaswamy because he said he wanted to cut aid to Israel. She said that Israel are important to America because they are the first line of defense against Iran. So a lot of people who are watching would not have picked up on this, but this comment would be very, very, very problematic if it was made by the president of the United States. And it's even problematic when made by a candidate, because the Arab Gulf states are, factually speaking, the first line of defense against Iran. They're the ones that are harassed in the Gulf in their shipping when Iran want to create problems. They're the ones that have been attacked by the Iranians directly in 2019 in Saudi Arabia, the oil fields, and then indirectly in 2022 in Abu Dhabi from Yemen by Iranian proxies. And they are very, very keenly aware and very sensitive to their perception that the U.S. do not take that threat seriously enough. And there's been so much commentary in the last few years about these countries and their shift towards multipolarity and how that's created so many problems for the United States. And one of the fundamental factors behind that shift to multipolarity and the shift away from, U.S. requests on all kinds of topics is this specific issue. Their belief that the U.S. don't recognize that they are in the crossfire of the Iranians. And this is such a sore point. It's created so many problems. And she has demonstrated on stage that she doesn't recognize it. Now, if it's one thing, if you want to take a position that the United States should, to some extent, disregard these countries' acute sensitivity to the threat that is faced on them from Iran, and that the United States should not give them the security guarantees that they're asking for. The U.S. policy for a long time has been that the Israelis should have a qualitative military advantage over those Arabic-speaking countries. That's been the U.S. policy. The Arab states don't like it, and you can try to defend it. But if you want to make that argument and you want to make a clear policy and you want the Arab countries to understand where you stand and believe that you're approaching in good faith, you have to approach the issue from a factual basis. And that's the problem. So if you are saying, we understand that those countries have a huge risk from Iran, but we do not think that it is in the U.S. interest to provide them with as thorough a security umbrella as we provide to the Israelis, that's one thing. And you can make that argument, you can have that discussion. But if you disregard the threat that they're facing and you claim that a third country is the first line of defense against the Iranians, that's when you get into a lot of trouble. And so I think that comment really stood out to me for this reason. And I don't think very many other commentators picked up on it, but I think it demonstrates a lot of issues with the worldview that she's developed.
No, I think that's a great analysis. But in the grand scheme of things for the American voter and this election, I think her, vociferous support of Israel, good, Iran, bad, resonates with those voters. Ultimately, I personally think the winner of the debate was Donald Trump, because folks were thinking that Trump would regret skipping this debate, not only because he's going to miss out on the opportunity for the media, but you are going to see candidates who have serious policy ideas. I don't think anybody really displayed serious policy positions during the debate. The second point is that there were going to be more statesmen and stateslady-like. It was just a mud fight. It was kind of similar to Trump when he debated, because Vivek tried to almost be Trump 2.0. And third, that maybe Ron DeSantis would be able to take advantage of the vacuum and move into that leadership position, and he didn't. So that all together with the fact that he just got arraigned today in Georgia, John, and will suck oxygen out of the media cycle from the debate, and it'll be forgotten almost instantly. I think Trump, for a political perspective, where he stands in this race, I think he made the right decision. And based on how the events turned out last night, I think he was a clear winner.
The counterfactual is quite unknown because we haven't seen him in this kind of setting really since 2016. The closest that we got was, the debate against Joe Biden, and there seemed to be a pretty clear regression from the way he performed the 2016 debates there. It's now been even longer since the 2016 cycle debates. So it's not clear how he would have performed if he had been on that stage. So it's hard to say whether he made the right decision to attend or not with that in mind. But I think that if we can say anything about that so far, it's that other candidates had the opportunity to be under the spotlight. There's been some polling that came out in the 24 hours since the debate that suggested that those candidates had made a positive impression. I think their favorables in almost all the cases had increased at least a little bit. There was a question of, will you ever consider voting for these candidates? And those numbers increased in the polls that I saw. So all you can really say is it was an opportunity for these candidates to get attention, and they got more of it than they would have had if he had been there. Is it enough for any of them to get the momentum that they would need to become a front runner or make a big challenge against his standing in the polls? Probably not. There's going to be more, and we'll see if his decision to attend the next one is different than this one. The first debate of the cycle, like we were saying, is usually not the most interesting or transformative. Usually the moments we remember from presidential debates happen much later on. So it was kind of unusual, like we said, that they actually got combative in the very first debate. It's a pretty big milestone towards the beginning of the actual presidential election cycle. So I'm glad we had a chance to talk it through.